So I wrote 3 ways of thinking about this. There's personal loss, there's family loss, and then there's collective loss. Personal's pretty obvious, right? Family loss, for instance, when a mother loses the father, the child didn't know the father, but the mother is in grief. That's a form of family loss that's affecting the child, that may not be directly to the child. And sometimes I think that's confusing to people because the child will say, I didn't know them. But they're seeing their mother break down every day, and their mother is their sole supporter. So there is the loss is transferred onto the child, and I've learned to take that very seriously, especially if it's a loss that's really strong to the mother or the father. It's really hard to see your parent in pain. And they a lot of what their strategies are is to get strong or to be the supporter for their parent. It happens very naturally. And then collective loss is the environmental thing that we're feeling. That's a piece of collective loss. Even past generation. And that's something I've begun to appreciate more recently, that a child can carry loss from a grandfather that in their cells. There's something called transgenerational transmission of trauma. I think that's the right word. And the Holocaust families have really done a lot of work on this, that children of Holocaust survivors, even though they were never in it, they have dreams, they have nightmares. The terror is still in the family, the collective system. And just the collective, the Native Americans, same thing. There's a Yes, the Native American Holocaust. There's a collective sorrow in that culture that they've done a lot of work on that as well. So I want to just name those different kinds of loss. And an example of the collective one, I had a boy. I have a group of boys that come and they cry pretty regularly. They use it as a place to grieve. And they'll hold on to it and share it, and they're very sweet with one another. But one boy recently came in and he said, my grandpa, he didn't know that they were bad people. He was forced to fight with the Nazis. He did not want to fight with the Nazis. And he just cried and cried because I think when he was sitting with his grandpa, he could feel his grandpa's sorrow. And then so he came to me to release it there. And so that's an example of the collective. I'm sorry? And slavery, thank you, yes. That's another collective piece. Thank you for, yeah, there's many, aren't there? Yeah, so in different cultures, we have these different collective pieces of loss that we're dealing with and that run through the generations. And it's important to acknowledge those. I think sometimes even I have kids that teachers say they tell lies, but they tell lies about being in the war. And then I started thinking, maybe these aren't lies. Maybe this is collective trauma that they're trying to process, and everybody keeps telling them it's a lie. So when they start telling stories that don't fit with their own experience. I mean, one boy, I finally just said, would you just show me in the sand tray what that war was like? And his eyes just lit up, and he was so happy, and he acted out this whole war scene. To me, it doesn't even matter anymore. He needed to process that, whether it was from a story, whether it was from a movie, and maybe it was collective loss that he carried in him. It didn't matter. I was just honoring his experience and giving it room to breathe. So in the personal losses, one of the things I've found is that the more it affects your daily life, the harder it is on a daily level. Like a child who sees his dog every single day, that loss can be deeper than a grandfather that they barely knew or that they knew, because they can still kind of pretend the grandfather's there, but that loss of that dog is present every single moment he gets home. And with the elderly, this is true too, when a pet dies, because that becomes their family. And so the loss of a pet for a single person or for an elderly person can be a very powerful loss. And I think it's just important not to minimize the losses or to think, that loss is trivial. Because if it's something that impacts you daily, it's going to affect your feelings a lot. So that's just a little bit of background. And now I want to talk about So another piece is that we, in the grief literature, they say you go through denial, you go through anger, you go through sorrow, and then you go through acceptance. But what they're learning now is that they don't come in order like that. Denial can come, and then anger can come, and then you can go back in denial and back into sorrow. It's not nearly as linear. Thank goodness, because I'm not a very linear person. And it didn't ever work that way for me either. So you can go into denial, into sorrow, into anger, back into denial. They just kind of jump around. And for children, I mean, one of the things that happens in a loss that affects the whole family, sometimes the child won't process it with the parents. Some of the things the children have told me, like I'll give you an example. I think concrete examples are best. One boy came in and they were talking about grandmas. Grandma's pets. Those are the main ones that I deal with as a child counselor. He said, I killed my grandma. And I said, what? And he said, I did, Mrs. Gillen. He started crying hysterically. This was 2 years ago. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, my grandma was in the hospital and she was really sick and I had a cold. And my mom said I couldn't go see her because I could make her sick. And then I went to see her, and she died the next day. So in his mind, he went to see her, made her sick. The next day she died, he killed her. What he didn't know was the mom knew she was going to die. And the mom knew that that was the last chance that she was going to have to see him. So it didn't matter anymore that he was sick. But she forgot, in all the chaos, she forgot to transmit that little bit of information. So he carried it around with him as though he had killed his grandmother. So I said, have you told your mom about this? And he goes, no, she's so sad. I don't want to make her any sadder. If I tell her I killed her, she'll be really sad. So I called his mom, and she said, why didn't he ever tell me that? I said, because you were in sorrow. And I hear that over and over again. They don't talk to their parent about it because their parent's already so upset. They don't want to add to the sorrow of their parents. So they'll hold a lot in. That's why it's so important to have other community members to help with these sorts of things, because they will share with us. And it could be a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. I had a little girl who, her little friend died, and 2 years later, she came in and she cried and cried, and the teacher's like, why is she coming to your room all the time? I said, well, she's processing the loss of her friend. And the teacher said to me, that was 2 years ago. I said, yes, it was, and she's processing it now. She had details. She described, it was open casket. She was a 6-year-old friend. She described the white dress she was wearing, the flowers in her hair. She told me detail after detail after detail. And she needed to tell that story over and over and over again. So another piece that I've learned about that with kids is that they'll tell you the story cognitively over and over and over again. And then they'll tell you some other things. It's like they're testing the waters. Is this person safe to is this person safe to break down to? So they'll tell you the story cognitively. They'll tell you all kinds of other things, maybe a little sorrow that happened with a friend. And they're seeing, can you handle this? They're really, really insightful. If you can't handle it, they won't tell you. So we have to be able to stay present with them when they're in sorrow, because they know when you're not. They're very instinctual. So there's something that I've noticed over the years about that 3rd grade level. I don't know what it is, but they'll tell me the story over and over and over again. And then at 3rd grade, there's some awareness. I think there's some social awareness that might develop. And they'll come, like an example, a little girl who had been in foster care. She'd been removed from her home, and she told me the story probably 100 times. It was a traumatic story. And traumatic stories do need to be told over and over and over again. And their friends get tired of hearing it, but we can't get tired of hearing it. If we do, it won't get processed. Then one day she marches in and she sat down and she said, I need to make an appointment. And I said, what's going on? And she said, it's not normal not to live with your mom and dad. I'm different. And she burst into tears. And she told me the story all over again, only this time she told it with the feelings. And I don't know if any of you have ever noticed that you'll tell the story, and then one day you tell the story and the feelings connect. And that's a different experience. But you do it cognitively first, which is part of the denial, because it's so hard to tell it and feel it at the same time. At first you're just, wow, this happened? This happened. This really did happen. You're just reminding yourself this happened. And then, oh man, this happened. You know, it comes down into here and into the body. But there is something about that 3rd grade level I've noticed over and over again. And then there's another one at 6th or 7th grade where they get mad. The anger comes out. So it's one of the benefits of working with children over time is you really get to see them go through these different phases. So a couple of tools. We're going to talk a little bit about stories and some of the things I do. And then we'll do a little bit of a practice. Some of my favorite books. I love this story called Lifetimes. And the reason I like it is because it has a rhythm. And it just, I think that as a culture we're not great at addressing death. We're so afraid of it. And there's a lot of, I think that's the whole issue around end of life. And we have to save everybody. Like that's the main thing is we got to save them. No, it doesn't matter if they can't walk or talk or eat or anything. We got to save them. Life is important. Sometimes death is okay. Death is part of life. And I think that if they learn that early, it would be a lot more helpful. So this one explains that in this very rhythmic way. There's a beginning and an ending for everything that is alive, and in between is living. So it's just saying it directly. All around us everywhere, beginnings and endings are going on all the time, with living in between. This is true for all living things, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, even for the tiniest insect. Nothing that is alive goes on living forever. How long it lived depends on what it is and what happens while it is living. Sometimes living things become ill or they get hurt. Mostly, of course, they get better again, but there are times when they are so badly hurt or they are so ill that they die because they can no longer stay alive. This can happen when you are young or old or anywhere in between. It may be sad, but it's the way of all things, and it's true for everything that is alive, for plants, for people, for birds, for fish, for trees, for animals, even for the tiniest insect. So you see the rhythm in this story? And it talks about the different lifestyles of things. Everything has its own special lifetime. Trees have their special lifetime. Rabbits. And they know this because at least the kids I work with are farm kids, a lot of them, and they have animals. So animals is their first experiences. And they see bugs, and they are experiencing death already. So I think it's important just to be honest with them about it. So this is one of my favorite books about that. Just in terms of just introducing the concept of death in a normal, natural way. So then, when it happens, all the feelings that come up and how it happens. One of the ways it happens is the accidents. And accidents are hard deaths because they're so sudden. There's no time to prepare for it. And it's just like this sudden, whoa, what do you mean? It just comes out of the blue, right? This book, The Accident, is a very powerful book. It definitely makes kids cry. One time I read this book in a 3rd grade classroom, and a parent got very angry at me for making her child cry. And I'm thinking, I asked her this question. I said, do you let your children watch TV? And she said, I don't know what this has anything to do with it. I'm like, how many murders has she watched? And I can't read a book about a dog dying? There's something wrong. If she can watch thousands of violent murders and play those violent murder games, but I can't read a book about a dog dying, I'm sorry. I stand by reading this book. It's emotional, yes, and it made her cry, and thank goodness, because she needed to cry. She needed to get it out. So this was a hard one. This is about a boy whose dog dies. And I like this because it gives one of the problems, one of the things that occurs with trauma like that is that you see it. Anybody ever been in a car accident? You know that thing where you see it over and over and over and over in your mind? Because your mind is trying to understand it. Like, wow, what that happened. You just keep seeing it. And this page in the book talks about that. They took Christopher home to bed where he relived the accident over and over in his mind. He tried to pretend that the truck had missed the dog, or that he hadn't called and Bodger had stayed on the other side, or he pretended that they hadn't left the dirt road where there were hardly ever any cars, or that they had just stayed home and waited. But the bad dream always rolled on out of his control until the moment when Bodger was lying in the road, Again, Christopher saw his parents' white faces behind the windshield and the curious faces of the other people as they drove past. I like that because it validates that experience. And it's a child having that experience. And how we wish that we could have made it different. You know, if only. There's all those if onlys. It addresses that. This has got a nice ending where they go and find a rock. And one of the things that we'll talk about a little bit is ceremony, creating little ceremonies. Kids are great at that. But that's what his father does. They go along the creek and find a rock to represent the dog, and then they place it at his grave. And his father put his arm around Christopher's shoulders. Christopher turned and let the strong arms enfold him. He didn't feel angry with his father anymore, and that felt good too. This story brought up some grief for a boy whose father couldn't feel his pain. He started crying and said, "My dad couldn't do that. He never hugged me." And so there was a loss in not having that support. One boy, after reading this story, he goes, "I don't cry. I don't cry at funerals." I said, "You don't?" He goes, "No, I went to my grandma's funeral and I just stood there like this." I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Well, I looked around at all the men, and that's what they were doing. So I figured that's what I was supposed to do." So men, those of you who are here, please model crying for your children so that the boys know that it's okay, because it is okay. And so the accident, I had a lot of work challenge at the end of this year, so I will write these up for you. Make them available. This is a different kind of death. This is the kind of death that's expected, the grandfather death. Anybody know a Leakey? I love a Leakey, and it's about her and her grandfather. And they spend a lot of time together growing up. And this page, she knew that one day he would die. But when he did, she was not ready. And she hurt inside and out. It was spring, and she cut blossoms from his trees and gave them to him and said, "Good night forever, Papuli." But he did not answer. So even though she knew it was coming, she was still not ready. And this book addresses that in a beautiful way. One time I did this story, and a girl came in and said, and we write words, like what are some of the feelings you have about when somebody dies, and sad, angry. And this one girl said, "Miss Gillen, I don't have any of those feelings." I said, "Really? Tell me about it." And her grandmother had Alzheimer's and lived in the home and screamed. And she said, "I was kind of glad." I'm like, of course you were glad. It was so hard to have your grandmother in the house. And I didn't even think to bring that one up. And I was really glad I had enough of a relationship with her that she could admit that there were feelings of relief. Because when somebody is in so much pain and they're really not living anymore, there is relief. And it's okay to feel that. So I haven't found a good book that addresses that. I'm not sure how you would. But just to know that that's another feeling that comes up, especially for that kind of a death. So The Two of Them by Leakey. This book, When Dinosaurs Die, this is more direct, but I like it because it goes through different feelings. So when someone you care about dies, you may have all kinds of feelings. It may be hard to believe that a dead relative or friend won't be around. It's not true. Grandma isn't dead. She is too. So this conversation between, brother and sister. Here's one about a dream. In my dream, Yo-Yo was still alive. So that's another thing that happens a lot. That kids will tell me, find it too, Karen? In dreams that losing someone special who is special to you is very hard to understand. Please, God, let Daddy be alive again. I want him back. So, and then it goes through sad, and then also angry. It's also natural. I hate the doctors. Who do you get mad at? For him, it's the doctors. And so it gives some ideas about how to care for yourself around that. And it says, when someone you love dies, there is no right or wrong way to feel. What you feel is the way you feel. So this is another nice resource. I don't read this whole thing straight through. It's too much. I pick out pages and read it to them. This is one of my favorites, Nadia the Willful. It's an older book. I had a boy that he lost his baby brother to SIDS. And he'd been really angry and acting out. But they didn't talk about it. You know that thing where you just kind of stop talking about it. So this is a story about a girl from I don't know where, the desert somewhere. And her brother, you might not be able to see this, but he goes out in the desert on a horse and he never returns. It's another kind of a loss, that kind of loss that you never get resolved. You know, like the missing children. Oh, that must be the hardest loss because there's this unanswered question. And this is similar to that. Thank goodness I haven't ever had to deal with that one, but I'm sure if any of you have, I'm sure it's a very complicated one. That feeling of hope and resolve. Hope and resolve. Oh, maybe they're still alive. No, maybe they're not. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. You know that. And she's struggling with this in this book. But eventually they realize that at last, Tariq knew in his heart that his favorite son, Hamed, had been claimed, as other Bedouin before him, by the drifting sands. And he told Nadia what he knew, that Hamed was dead. Nadia screamed, and so here's the anger, and this is how I read it. Nadia screamed and wept and stamped the sand, crying, "No! Not even Allah will take Hamed from me!" Until her father could hear no more and sternly bade her to silence. So I read it with all that fierce behind it because I want to give them that. So he silences the whole community and nobody's allowed to talk about it. But she starts to talk about it. Nadia did too, as her father decreed, though each day held something to remind her of Hamed. As she passed her brothers at play, she remembered games Hamed had taught her. As she walked by the women weaving patches for the tents and heard them talking and laughing, she remembered tales Hamed had told her and how they made her laugh. Each memory brought Hamed's name to Nadia's lips, but she stilled the sound. And each time that she did so, her unhappiness grew until finally she could no longer contain it. She wept and raged at anyone and anything that crossed her path. Soon, everyone at the oasis fled at her approach, which was a perfect story for this boy because that's exactly what was happening to him. He was so angry, everyone fled and was upset with him, and he didn't understand it. So finally, her mother, she kept talking about it, and she kept talking about it to everyone, and her mother was afraid for her. But soon, all who could listen to her could see Hamed's face clearly before them. So talking about it brought him back, right? There's something about shutting off the memory. I mean, shutting off the talking shuts off the memory. But as soon as you can talk and share the memories, then you get him back, right? So Shepherd sends him off. I have forbidden my... Shepherd says his name, and the father hears him. And he says, "I've forbidden my son's name to be said, and I promised punishment to whoever disobeyed my commands. So shall it be. Before the sun sets and the moon casts its first shadow on the sand, you will be gone from this oasis, never to return." "No!" cried Nadia, hearing her father's words. "I have spoken," roared the sheik. It shall be done." And he sent the shepherd off. So she goes and finds her father. In the hours that followed, fear of being banished to the desert made everyone turn away from Nadia as she tried to tell them of Hamed and the things he had done and said. But she goes up to her father and she says, "You will not rob me of my brother Hamed," she cried, stamping her foot. "I will not let you." And I read it to them just like that. This was the beginning of that boy coming out. He allowed himself his anger. And then Tariq looked at her, his eyes colder than the desert night. But before he could utter a word, Nadia spoke again. "Can you recall Hamed's face? Can you still hear his voice?" Tariq started in surprise, and his answer seemed to come unbidden to his lips. "No, I cannot." And he wept. Nadia's tone became gentle. "There is a way, honored father. Listen." So she told him the story of Hamed and brought his memory back. It's hard to get through this sometimes, though. Crying. It's a beautiful story. So, anger, let it out. And it's part of it. So the last piece I want to talk about is once they're gone, how do we hold them? How do we keep them? How do we help them keep that person close? So there's a couple books I want to share with you and a couple ideas. Baba Yaga and Vasilisa the Brave. Her mother dies. It's a Cinderella story. And she has a doll that her mother made her. And I'll read you just this one page. It was a doll made by her mother just a few months before she died. All her mother's love had gone into the making of that doll. When it was finished, her mother told her, If ever you are in need, this doll will comfort you. And in truth, by some miracle, the doll did. In other ways, it was a plain and simple doll. Indeed, the stepsisters would never have owned such an ordinary one. But Vasilisa kept it near her always. It was her secret. This is the internalized mother that can be a secret, especially if you're in a household where you have a stepmother or somebody that doesn't appreciate that love. You have to keep it hidden. And that's what this story is talking about. Most astonishing of all, the doll was alive. At night, when Vasilisa was left to the darkness of her shabby quarters, she would pour out all her hopes and dreams to this small creature. The doll would listen, her eyes glowing like embers, and quietly, so that no one else could hear, she would whisper loving words of comfort and advice. To have such a treasure made Vasilisa's days seem shorter, caused her work to seem lighter, and gave her a sense that she was not alone in the world. So finding an object, something, a rock, a locket, anything to help that person, that child, hold that person close is really helpful. And this story, it's a really dark, this story is a little dark, but I like it. You and I have something in common. She has to go do all these tasks. Here's the evil Baba Yaga. In this story, Baba Yaga is quite evil. I like to let him look right at this picture because it is scary. And death is scary, but I hold the page open and I just let them study her, look at those gray teeth, look at all of that, because then we're facing it. We're not, pretending it isn't there. Anyway, so the mother helps her to do all these tasks set out by this woman. So I like this story. And then I love this story too. I've had children tell me that loved ones that have been gone have come to them. One little girl whose father, she was raised by her father, and when she was 4, he died of a heart attack mowing the lawn. And she and her little 2-year-old sister were the only ones at home. And she ended up living with her aunt and uncle. And she said that one day she was stepping out onto the road, and her father pulled her out of their way. And I said, "You mean your uncle?" She said, "No, I mean my father." Like, "You stupid." I'm like, "Oh," she goes, "He protects me all the time. He's always there." And so he was there, and he pulled her out of the way. In my family, I have a beautiful story. A cousin, well, those cousin things, whatever the relationship is. I have a lot of them, and they're very complicated. But anyway, a grandfather died, and there was he was very close to these 3 children, his grandchildren, and there was a fire. The furnace blew up. And the little boy got out, but one of the other children were inside. And he went back into the burning house to get the other child. When he came out, they were amazed. The firemen were amazed. And they said, "How did you do that?" And he said, "Oh, Grandpa was there. He showed me the way." So everybody believed him because it was hard. It's hard to get through a burning house and find a child and pull him out. But he said, "Grandpa came to me. He took my hand, and he led me to my sister and helped me out with her." So I love those stories because and even if they don't have stories like that, it's just nice to give them ways to hold it. So this is a story about some Native American, I think Lakota, yeah. Their grandmother died, and they're looking up in the clouds, and can you see her face? It said, "As the cloud people changed their shape, the face of a woman emerged. 'Look,' my brother gasped, 'grandmother!' Elk-Tooth Woman had died that spring, and we missed her very much." But they saw her in the clouds. They get lost, and they're scared. Well, let me show you the picture where they're lost and scared. And they can't find their way back home. They wandered out too far. And so Sister Girl, Young Wolf said, "Sister Girl, the stars are dancing." I looked up. High above us, the stars were becoming shapes, as the clouds had done that afternoon. First, there was a coyote, then a bear, a hawk, and many other creatures, both animal and human. Chanting, the star people encircled us. "They are the spirits of the old ones who walked on this earth," I told my brother. So this sense, there is collective sorrow and there's collective support. So thank goodness we can tune into that too. Young Wolf was first to see Elk-Tooth Woman dancing among them. "It's my grandma," he cried. "You are safe now, my little young wolf," she whispered, holding out her arms. "I'm here, my sister girl." I was delighted to see our grandmother. Young Wolf was happy but confused. He said, "Grandma, I thought I would never see you again." Smiling, she drew us close to her, tenderly rocking back and forth. Beneath a heaven full of stars, we fell into a deep sleep. So the grandmother came to them, and she leads them back home. And they know that she'll always be there in her heart. So this is a beautiful story about keeping them in your life. There's a story about Ishi. Anybody know the story of Ishi? It's a Native American who everything was gone. He lost his whole tribe, his language, and everything, and they put him in a museum to live in San Francisco. It's a terrible story, but the psychologists that worked with him fell in love with him. They deeply loved him, and he would go into the hospitals and sing chants to the children. And they were really curious because he didn't show a lot of the signs of trauma that a lot of people who have lost that much would show. And they said that there was something about, he didn't believe they were gone. They were still with him. And there was something about that that helped survive the experience and keep his heart open. So that's their experience. But I think there's something to that, that if we can keep our heart open and still have some connection, it's so much easier to go on. To just cut it off and is just impossible, really. So the other thing I do is people collect these for me. It's a nice little activity for the kids. We call them heart boxes. So they can pick one out, and then we put in pictures. They bring in pictures. They bring in, and we decorate the inside. Some we put felt in them. They can put pictures on the outside, their names or whatever, and they'll just come. I've had children work on these over a couple of years. Can I get my heart box out and work on it? And it's not every day. I don't like everyday loss groups because that's not how it works. I like just ongoing groups that, like when they're ready to talk about it, you talk about it. When they're not, you don't. I mean, I had somebody working with me, and she started a loss group, and the first day she read a story about loss. And she's like, they didn't open up a lot. I'm like, well, you just met them. When you first meet someone, she was well-intended. She was trying to do the right thing. But first of all, they're often not ready. It takes 6 or 7 months. It could be a year before they're ready to even talk about it. You're just building a relationship, and they'll let you know when they're ready to talk about it. They'll ask you about it as long as you're open. And you can read stories to help bring it out, or other children will bring it out. Like somebody comes in. There's a girl that her brother died in a car accident, and she just recently shared that with me, and she told me the same thing, what happened in the accident. I didn't read the book, but she told me details of that day, where she was, remembering the phone call. That happens, right? But it's 2 years later that she actually brought it up, and it was because another child had lost a dog, and that stimulated the conversation, and there was a safety that was built in the community. So those are some ways to think about helping these. That's a lot. No, I wanted to do a little relaxation at the end here. But any questions people have about any of this?
After you've done a little bit of the reading and a little processing, then are you moving into grounding poses?
Yes, thank you for asking that. I had a group with boys, these third grade boys, and they were all crying. I'm laughing just because they're so sweet with each other. They'll circle around and pat it. It's okay, we won't make fun of you. And then they'll circle around another one, and they'll circle around another one. And it's like, okay, we got to get them back to class. I said, okay, you guys, I think we better get up and do some yoga, because I think we need to get ourselves back into our bodies and get strong before we go back to class. And he goes, yeah, because when we talk about it, all those feelings start coming up, and the yoga helps us stomp them back down. And not that we are trying to stomp the feelings down, but he had an understanding that they come up and that you've got to create this stomping back down is the grounding. And he knew it in his body. So that's exactly what we did. And then I tell a funny story or something like that, or tell jokes. We were telling jokes the other day, and they were very bad, but they made the kids laugh.
This might be more than you can really get into right now, but I had a student last year who had one of his parents committed suicide, and have you had to deal with that, and how do you deal with that in a way that, it's so hard for anybody to understand why somebody would take their own life, and it's so especially for a child to look at it, it just doesn't make any sense. And how do you deal with that? I had no idea how to deal with it as a teacher.
I know. Jeremy hasn't been in my other workshop. I have 3 suicides in my life, 2 parents, so I know that fairly personally, and so it's a complicated loss because not only did they choose it, but then there's this way in which there's a certain amount of shame around it. Like, you bring it up, and people are like, ooh, how do I handle that? I could feel that as a child. So first, just being as open to it as you can and letting them talk about it and staying present with that. And letting them talk about the conditions around it. That's what helped me, and that's what has helped the other people that I've worked with that have had suicide, is that if you can understand that there were some conditions around it that made it too hard for them to get through, that it wasn't necessarily an act against you, but there was something, sorrow. They can understand a broken leg or a broken body. And then I say, you know, but nobody can see the broken heart. But sometimes people's hearts are so broken that they don't know how to get out of it. And when we can understand that that was where they were, they just kind of like being in a little box that they can't get out of. And that was the only way they knew how to get out of it. And then they can understand how important it is for them to get help, too. So, I mean, I could go into it a lot longer, but it is a very complicated loss. And the losses like divorce are complicated because you don't have a ceremony. With death, there's a ceremony. But with these divorces or dads disappearing, those are complicated losses too, for the same reason suicide is. They've chosen it. And just letting them ask those questions. I did family trees, and there's a girl. So being left is similar in the same way. And we did a family tree of hers, and her mom left her. And when we looked at her family tree, her little brother, there's an abusive relationship between her grandparents. Her mother's little brother died when he was 2. Her mother's first baby died of SIDS. And when we looked at that, I'm like, oh, I see what's happening here. You were your mom's first baby after that death. She had all these losses. She didn't know how to deal with that pain. That girl's old enough to understand that there was some collective loss in that mother that was so big. And she can connect to it through her own loss. So helping her understand what occurred to make that happen, so it's not such a mystery. Because it is a mystery, and if we can't talk about it, it stays a mystery. But the more it's just like Nadia the Willful. That's probably why that story brings tears up for me, because it's like, oh, I'm going to talk about it. Because there was so much silence around it, especially around suicide.
Yeah, as I was going to say, the talking part is what was so hard. I mean, you know, I had another kid in the class whose dog got hit by a car, you know, and they could talk about it, and they could grieve, and everybody in the class could, but this one student didn't want to talk about his parent, and so, but it was so hard for me, because it was like I could understand why he didn't want to bring it up, but he didn't get to share with the class. He didn't get to have that support of the class, and nobody really knew what had happened to his dad, so.
But he will talk about it if he's given the space, and it may take a long time.
Right.
There's some books at the Dougie Center. If you don't know about the Dougie Center, that's an important one to know. And there's some books specifically on suicide that you can order from them. And just having that on your shelf, just having it available. One day they'll go, oh, they're going to see it. And then someday they're going to pick it up off the shelf and go, I want to read that one.